Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the Middle East after a trip to China, where he was grilled by a BBC reporter who asked about the United States' hypocritical stance on China and Israel. Let's take a listen.
You're sitting here in China where they are managing to paint the United States as hypocrites. You're asking China to stop supplying components, not weapons, components to Ukraine, while you're supplying weapons to Israel. So it allows, it erodes the credibility of the United States, not just here in China, but around the world. Don't you think?
Of course, China will do whatever it will do to distort our policies and to misinform its own people about what we're actually doing, what we're not doing, what we stand for, what we don't stand for. That happens. When it comes to Israel, we've also been very clear that we want to make sure that Israel has the capacity to defend itself.
Now, Blinken says he's trying to muster a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. CNN reports that there may be movement on that front. Hamas is considering a proposal by Egypt where as many as 33 hostages kidnapped from Israel would be released in exchange for a pause in fighting. Palestinian prisoners would be released, and then after a sustained period of calm, more hostages, bodies, and prisoners would be exchanged by the warring factions.
There are conflicting reports as to whether Israel is okay with this deal. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel will launch an offensive into Rafah, a former safe haven for civilian Gazans, regardless of the state of a ceasefire. Here to discuss all this and more is Hen Mazzig, a senior fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you make of recent developments on this front? Obviously, we are seeing protests at numerous college campuses across the country by pro-Palestinian activists calling for an end to the violence in Gaza and for their institutions to not be invested in it or financially tied to it. Where do you think the mood of the country is at?
Yeah, and that's a good place to start because I've seen your show yesterday, and I think, Briahna, you mentioned that the student protests reflect a larger trend around Americans who support the end of the war. And on the same day, there was actually a poll that came out of Harvard that shows that there's a large support to Israel continuing the war. Actually, over 70% of American voters say that they think Israel should go into Rafah and that Hamas should not stay in power after this war, which was very interesting, but I think it just says that the trend in American public is quite different than the one we're seeing on social media. For far too long, people take social media so seriously and thinking that likes on Twitter or comments on YouTube, I mean, even on this account, reflects some sort of a trend within American public opinion, but it's completely the opposite. And I think the fact that we're seeing so much violence and hate coming from those protests is actually pushing American voters. Yes, I know majority of them are probably older demographic, but still, on all age group, majority of Americans still support Israel and support Israel continuing the war and finishing Hamas.
Getting back to the question at hand here, which is getting these hostages returned who've been held for over 6 months now in Israel. As we reported, in Gaza rather, as we reported on this show, there have been deals on the table since immediately after October 7th that have been rejected by Netanyahu, largely because he has said he wants to eliminate Hamas before he will stop the fighting. Hostage families in Israel are now protesting, as we alluded to, Benjamin Netanyahu perceiving him as not prioritizing hostage exchange. It was just announced earlier today that hostage families plan to protest outside of the Prime Minister's office during a cabinet meeting today. Can you speak to the attitude of hostage families in Israel who do feel like Benjamin Netanyahu isn't doing everything in his power to get those hostages returned?
Just to correct that, it wasn't Israel that rejected the ceasefire proposals. It was actually Hamas. And that's not what Israel is saying. That's what America is saying. That's what the UK was saying, that Hamas continues to refuse every ceasefire deals and making absurd demands. And Israel has accepted over and over again every peace deal, every ceasefire agreement and release of the hostages on our parts. I know that there's frustration from the hostage families, which we can completely understand. I mean, those are families of 133 civilians and young girls that are held in Hamas captivity. There's a baby, a 1-year-old baby that is still held in Gaza, and we know they're probably held in Rafah. Those sorts of ceasefire agreements were not agreed by Hamas because there wasn't military pressure. We saw that in November when there was military pressure on Hamas, they agreed to the ceasefire deal. Now that Israel has stopped the military pressure in Gaza, and we see that the war has reduced with in its intensity, I think that's why Hamas is actually saying no. Hamas started this war on October 7th because they did not want to have peace. Their goal is not peace. That's not how you achieve peace with your neighbors by killing and murdering and raping young girls. You achieve peace by sitting down and negotiating, and that's what Hamas refused to do at this moment.
So what do you think America's role should be at this point, given that I think there is some dissatisfaction? You know, we might quibble over exactly what the polls say. I think there is broad support for the idea of a ceasefire, but of course, what does that mean in the details? Does that mean a terrorist organization remains in control of the Gaza Strip on Israel's borders or not, et cetera? Do you think the American government should put more pressure on Netanyahu to set reasonable goals for what is happening in Gaza and how much longer this is going to go on, given all of the civilian casualties that we are seeing in the region?
I mean, every civilian life that is being killed is a tragedy, and I'm hurting it. And I know most Israelis are hurting, even when especially when Palestinians are dying, because we don't want to see that. There wasn't a war again on October 7th. It started on October 7th because of Hamas. We want it to end. I think that America's role in this specific war must be to facilitate the peace agreement and put pressure on Hamas. Hamas is reacting to the international public opinion and to the trends we're seeing on social media. They are listening to what we're saying. They're listening to what the public is saying. And the more they see there's protests, and the more they see there's people that are willing to just minimize everything they are doing to the hostages and to Israelis, they're going to continue with that. If we want to really achieve peace for the Palestinians, and I want that. I want to see Palestinians receiving every peace, every dignity, and I want to see them protected from every violence. I don't want any Palestinian to be hurt. I'm very critical of Netanyahu's government, but the way to achieve it is by putting pressure on both parties. And I think Israel has been pressured so much for a war we didn't start it, and Hamas is receiving almost, this racism of low expectations, as if they don't know any better or they just are allowed to do that. And there wasn't any protest calling Hamas to stop, or not much, on college campuses. And I think that's what we need to see from the public, and I think that's what we need to see from America and the West.
You just said that you think that Palestinians deserve every kind of privilege and right. I want to ask two prongs to this. One, the United States just blocked Palestine being recognized as a state. It was singular, or almost singular, in its choice to veto Palestine being recognized as a country, a state. The rest of the world agrees that it should. That seems to be directly in contravention of the stated goal that America has of a two-state solution, and also to any lasting peace. And so I wanted you to speak to whether or not that is a right and a freedom that Palestinians should enjoy, basic statehood. And I also want to ask you about what you think of the ongoing occupation of the West Bank, in which there has been a rapid increase in violence after October 7th, and which has resulted in sanctions from the United States government on some of the bad actors who have been exercising outsized violence and death and killing against the Palestinians who live there.
I'll start with the second part in regards to the West Bank. We know that there has been over 500 attempted terror attacks that were stopped by the Israeli forces. That's the reason for the violence, because Hamas is still operating in the West Bank. We know that from Israeli intelligence, but also from American intelligence. And there's an agreement that Hamas is still there, and Israel is following those attacks because that's the important thing, is to stop them from executing them. In regards to the West Bank, of course, my hope is that the West Bank would be part of Palestine, that the West Bank and Gaza would be a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. And maybe to also address the point about the United States, I don't believe in one-sided attempts to get Palestine recognized. I don't think that that would help anyone. I don't think that this maximalist approach of all or nothing could help any side of
What
this
do you mean
conflict.
by one-sided attempt to get Palestine recognized? It does seem, to the extent that it's not really a side, it's the entire world standing against Israel in America who are objecting to that effort.
I'm not sure of that. I mean,
I'm very sure of that.
Okay, so we might just disagree with that. I think that the fact that we're seeing
I think that there's a factual record here. I mean, part of the issue here is that you said a number of statements, frankly, so many that it would spin this interview off into a wild place if I were to stop and object and try to correct the factual record on all of them. And I'm confident that the audience, because we've been having so many of these conversations for so long, can assess for themselves whether or not some of the representations that you're making are actually true. There has been a spike of violence in the West Bank, which is not run by Hamas and which cannot be justified by pointing to Hamas, that is completely unjustified and that has caught up children, and including an American citizen who has been killed in the West Bank because of Israeli violence. You alluded to the idea of mass rapes on October 7th. We're now in a place where almost 60 journalism professors in the United States of America have written a letter specifically saying that the New York Times needs to recall and review their Screams Without Word piece because it has been so roundly discredited by other media sources. So that's where we are.
There's an interview with rape victims that is available on YouTube, Screams Before Silent, that Sheryl Sandberg is sitting and interviewing rape victims. A woman that has been raped by Hamas, and she's saying that. Should we not believe her, Briahna?
No, there is an incredible report of one hostage who alleges that she was sexually assaulted. She doesn't specify the kind of. I don't mean that. I mean that in a strict legal sense. Sir, I mean that in a strict legal sense, not to undermine her credibility in the least. But she says that she was sexually assaulted. She doesn't specify specifically the kind of sexual assault. I'm just trying to be factual and clear.
Well, the guest didn't say mass sexual assault. I don't believe you said that there was sexual assault.
Want me to debate both of you right now, or can I take one at a time? And that happened after October 7th, so by her own testimony. So again, the justification that has been used repeatedly, and which you seem to allude to, was that the violence of October 7th was the start of this event, which I think it pretty clearly isn't. The occupation has been going on for 75 years following the Nakba, in which Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the land that is now known as Israel for the first time. My family was ethnically
cleansed from Iraq and Tunisia for being Jewish, along with 1 million Jewish refugees from the entire Middle East. We're going to talk about how far back are we going to go to the time when my family was forced to leave Iraq and Tunisia, along with 1 million Jewish refugees. That was before the Nakba. It was before 1948. It was in 1941
I don't know what are you saying that you would like to go back to live in Tunisia and you're being prevented to do so because Tunisia doesn't allow people to become citizens who aren't Muslim? Because that's the state of the case in Israel for Palestinians who want a right of return but who are denied that right because it is a Jewish state that does not allow non-Jewish people to have the same rights as Jewish people, regardless of whether or not they have ties to that particular land.
There's 2 million Palestinians living in Israel as Israeli citizens, and there's 0 Jews living in Iraq, where my grandmother was forced out from.
That sounds like a beef that you have with the administration of Iraq. But America doesn't give, America doesn't give $3.8 billion a year to Iraq, right, sir?
There's beef with a lot of Arab countries, and to pretend that Palestinian identity has nothing to do and it's not inherently tied to Arab identity, I never met any Palestinian that would say that they're not Arabs.
What is that? I don't understand. What does that mean? What's the relevance of whether or not Palestinian identity is tied to Arab identity?
You're saying that I have beef with Arab countries, and I'm explaining that there's a macro way to look at this conflict, and this conflict did not start in 1948. It's very easy to start a conflict then, but the conflict started when my family was forced to live alongside 1 million Jewish refugees from the entire Middle East, and we found refuge in Israel, in our ancestral homeland, where Jewish presence has been maintained for over a millennia. We have indigenous right to this land. Doesn't mean that Palestinians don't have the right to live there. I fully support their right, but we can't do it by reframing reality and changing stories. And
rather than relitigating decades old.
But Hen, it sounds like what you're objecting to is having been forced out of your land, of your family's homeland in Iran. Don't you feel empathy then for Palestinians who very, very recently, some of whom have still keys to their property that are now being lived in by people who, let's say, immigrated from Pennsylvania or New York or whatever in the United States of America, to have the right to return and live side by side with Jewish people and Christian people in Israel Isn't that an ideal sort of an outcome? The same way your family should not have been, if that is in fact what happened, pushed out of Iran.
It in fact what happened, not Iran, Iraq. And my family was forced out along with million Jewish refugees that today make up the majority of Jews in Israel. They're not from Pennsylvania. We've never been to Pennsylvania.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu is quite literally from Pennsylvania, but never mind that. He's from Philly. He's just outside of Philly. But go ahead.
Over 55% of Israeli Jews are descendants of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, from Middle Eastern and North African countries. The point that I'm making is that we are refugees, and of course we have sympathy, and that's why I'm saying that I support Palestinian rights, because I don't think that they deserve to be living without state. And I love the fact that there's 2 million Palestinians living inside Israel, that they are Israeli Arabs, and they have equal rights within Israel, while there are 0 Jews living in Iraq, when there was 150,000 people living there.
That's a good point. So why then is it okay for those 2 million Palestinians to live in Israel, but the 5 million Palestinians that live in Gaza and the West Bank can also be a part of Israel and enjoy those same rights and privileges?
I think that they have national identity that they have created, and it's Palestinian national identity. I don't think they're seeing themselves as Israelis. If you ask them if they want to be Israelis, I'm sure most of them wouldn't want to. And I think it will also change the makeup of Israel. And Israel will not be a Jewish state. And there's one Jewish state in the world. It's 0.03% of the entire Middle East. And
that seems to be quite plainly what it is. It's what is articulated repeatedly, and this is a difference of opinion. In America, we believe in religious pluralism. We think that when people try to demographically rig the country to maintain a white Christian racial and ethnic majority, we think that's a bad thing and counterintuitive to the goals and the ethos of this country, where immigrants have come for years to settle. And there's a different conversation that's happening in the Israeli context, where America spends billions of dollars every year to preserve the exact kind of community and system that we've rejected for ourselves here at home. And I think it's an interesting question for Americans to wrestle with as to why it is that an ethno-state in particular is what we're maintaining here, which does seem to be the root of a lot of the conflict between these populations.
You're saying you want a Palestinian state with a majority Arabs, so it will be another ethno-state.
Briahna wants them all in the same state, but I recognize that if most of the people, if the Israelis want it to be a Jewish Israeli state, and most of the Palestinians in Gaza don't want to be part of that state, it would be silly, I think, for us to impose what might be the Western American liberal ideal on this region when they don't want that themselves.
But we don't know what they want. People want different things. Different Palestinians support a 1 or 2 state solution.
We clearly know what they want.
How do you know that?
I mean, according to every poll, the majority of Palestinians in Gaza do support Hamas.
There's a difference of opinion among Palestinians as to whether or not a 1-state or 2-state solution is the best way forward. And those feelings have changed over the course of years when one or the other seems more or less plausible given the wars and the violence and the kinds of things that have happened. But I appreciate you coming here and talking through some of this with us today, Hen. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And just one last point, if I may.
Sure, real quick.
Real quick. I mean, the important point here is that I support Palestinian rights, I support Palestinian statehood, and I support Israeli statehood. I think both people need to live in peace and in security. But I don't think that the trends and the conversation on social media, on this channel, everywhere else, is contributing to it. It's pushing pushing both Israelis and Palestinians away when we need to come together. So that's an important part for me.
Thanks for joining us.